Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's event. Leonore Ailing, my colleague at the Center for California Studies who helped organize this event, sends her regrets for missing it and is homesick with the flu. My name is Rati Hernandez. I am the director of the LegiSchool Project, a civic education program for high school students. Today, we are very grateful to hear a presentation by Dr. Christopher Towler, Associate Professor of Political Science at Sac State. Dr. Towler has many accomplishments to his name, but today we're going to learn about one of them, the Black Voter Project, a unique public opinion survey of the African American voters. This is an annual survey, and today we're going to hear about the results of the 2022 survey and what they say about the turnout gap among Black voters. Dr. Towler, take it away.
Great. Thank you so much. I'm excited to be here to talk to you all about some recent work that I've conducted, research relating to the 2022 midterm elections that's hopefully going to look towards the 2024 general election with some suggestions as to how to close a turnout gap between Black voters and other voters across the country. Black turnout since the Obama era has been on the decline and is expected to continue to decline without some different action taking place. Black turnout in the midterms was a low point for Democrats. For example, it declined from 2018 to 2022 in key states like North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Georgia, and Michigan. Black turnout dropped more dramatically in less competitive states like Florida, where it was down 21%, and Alabama, down 15%. A 10% decrease in 2020 Black turnout levels in Georgia would likely result in a net loss of over 100,000 Democratic votes in a state that Biden won by just 11,000 votes. Such a decline would lead to big steps back in other battleground states like North Carolina, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. So this turnout gap that continues to grow, that's grown in 2020 and in the midterms just this last year, could be detrimental to any progress that the Democrats have made or hope to make looking forward. This research that I'm going to present today aims to understand differences between high and low propensity Black voters and use those lessons to mobilize and close the propensity or turnout gap. The overview of this project is that I will have basically two frameworks here. I'll be looking at how threat and empowerment works to mobilize Black voters and did around 2022. And the research design includes first 6 focus groups and a national multi-mode survey with over 2,000 African Americans. Within the survey, there's an original survey experiment with 3 experimental groups and 1 control group that I'll break down a little bit further in the presentation. And this project is hopefully going to continue with an additional wave of the survey, field experiments in battleground states going forward, and state-level replication of these findings that I'm going to present. To start, there is a qualitative aspect, as I mentioned, with the focus groups. We drew 6 focus groups on a national scale, 3 low-propensity focus groups, 3 high-propensity focus groups with 36 participants in total. We use these focus groups as a preliminary test of our hypotheses and approaches, hypothesizing that these ideas of threat are useful when understanding turnout, and ideas of empowerment can be useful, but in different ways than threat. And we work to establish internal validity and identify opportunities. As I mentioned, the 2 competing hypotheses that we looked at was first the threat hypothesis. This approach poses that perceptions of threats to the Black community are what motivates and mobilizes turnout in the Black electorate. The main threat frames that we tested had to do with the role that the MAGA movement, Trump, and the GOP itself play as potential threats to race. Comparatively, we also wanted to understand the role of empowerment, and so through our empowerment hypothesis, we posed that empowerment and perceptions of racial efficacy within the Black electorate would motivate and mobilize voters. So here, we also believe that, and research suggests that ideas of one's ability to influence politics and one's closeness with their representation will make them more likely to vote. This approach assumes that the Black electorate may be mobilized if they believe they can make a meaningful change, are represented, and heard. having Black representation is a major part of a sense of internal efficacy. When we talked to these people in the focus groups, a few different opinions stood out and a few different themes stood out. When it came to threat, when we asked respondents about Trump and MAGA, we saw discussions from both groups, but we saw the Trump and MAGA in particular perceived as being a threat to the Black community, especially among low propensity respondents or people in the focus groups that were the least likely to vote, those that hadn't voted in some time. Therefore, Trump and MAGA, when talking to people, had the potential to mobilizing as the discussions came up organically in conversations about we need to make sure we vote against the MAGA movement so we don't get another Trump. When prompted on how much threat in the GOP, how much of a threat the GOP is to the Black community, these groups were split. And here we saw sort of a political knowledge gap in that people who were high propensity voters or voted all the time understood the GOP as more of a threat, whereas low propensity groups did not. When it came to empowerment, when asked people in the focus groups about political leadership, specifically Black political leadership in the Democrats, they responded with cynicism. There was a lot of perceptions that Democrats failed to deliver to Black people resources and political power, and low propensity respondents were especially less likely to know about Black political leaders and are more likely to view them with negativity. To be a bit more specific, I'm just going to read a couple of these, but here are some of the responses word for word from some of these focus groups. When asked about a MAGA threat, a low propensity voter said MAGA itself or any of these extremist groups are not good for our personal fight, i.e. us Blacks and whatnot. That's why we have to continue to fight. That's why our fight will always go on. We will always have a racial fight, equality fight. So in response to MAGA, this Black low propensity voter was already talking about the needing to get out there and do something, to take action. When talking about a Republican threat, a high propensity voter said that this new extremism in the Republican Party is bad and is one of the things that is driving the fear in me as a minority, because it seems to me that racism, this hate, has been incubated in all of us. And so amongst this high propensity voter, even when talking about the GOP and not specifically about Trump or MAGA, there is still a sense of threat. There's still a relationship between the GOP and racism. Furthermore, when talking about Black leaders, here a high propensity voter recognized some of the senators, but also spoke some cynicism. And so for here, example, when looking at senators and I'm saying they have to step up, let's step up. I love Cory Booker and people like that. They're trying to step up. That's good. Where a low propensity voter on the other end basically said, I don't remember any of these people. And they could barely identify Kamala Harris. As we moved on from the focus groups, we took this information and formulated a public opinion survey, identifying some of these same themes, hoping to look now at a larger scale, again, a national scale with over 2,000 respondents, how these themes of threat and empowerment played out. This qualitative research design was a national scale, but we talked to 36 people more in depth. When we moved to the empowerment approach, we looked at both an observational part of the research where we asked specific questions and specific measures on the survey, and then we also had an experimental approach where we included a priming experiment in the survey itself, where respondents, as I mentioned, were split into 3 treatment groups and 1 control group. Within the experimental group, respondents were primed with 3 statements. 1 statement talking about Trump and MAGA as a threat, another statement talking about the GOP as a threat, and a 3rd statement not mentioning threat, but talking about Black leadership in the Democratic Party as empowering. When looking specifically at the national survey, right, we're able to include a number of other factors here in our analysis that are not as easily understandable within the focus groups. Things such as socioeconomic status, group identification, and religiosity. With the experiment, we're able to account for factors that might create sort of observational bias through splitting the groups up and comparing them to the control. And finally, even after accounting for explanations for turnout, something not possible in the focus groups, these survey-based findings mirror the focus group results. This increases our confidence that threat helps mobilize the Black community, but not uniformly. Threat has a greater impact on low propensity voters, particularly infrequent Black voters. To go a bit more in depth, right? Some of the key findings. A higher perception of threat to the Black community increases the probability that a Black voter will turn out to vote. As I mentioned, this is most likely the case for infrequent and very unlikely voters. Empowerment has an impact in some cases, but less of a relationship with turnout than threat. We believe this has a lot to do with the political times. As we've seen the Obama years, Obama's tenure, empowerment would have likely had a far larger impact and influence than we see today. And finally, we find that of the threats tested, intense feelings of threat from a second Trump presidency is the most effective in increasing vote probability. However, as I'm going to talk about in a little bit, there are other threats that could still be useful in understanding Black turnout and in continuing to sort of close this gap between Blacks and other groups. So when looking at the experiment in particular, respondents were split into 4 groups. We had 3 priming statements. The purpose of this was to see how each of these priming statements affected political participation by asking African American respondents about the importance of different political acts following these priming statements. So each group, other than the control group, was given either a statement about Trump and MAGA being a threat, a statement about the GOP being a threat, or the statement about racial empowerment. And then they were asked a battery of questions about political participation. What we can see is that when looking at voter propensity here, we can see that going from those that were non-voters, infrequent voters, frequent voters, and super voters, when we look at the importance of voting in state and local elections, the Trump threat and the GOP threat have a substantial influence on whether or not someone said it was important to participate in state and local elections, especially for non-voters and infrequent voters. We can see that the control group is the yellow dot. There is a substantial difference between those that received the threat primes and those that did not or received the empowerment prime for non-voters and infrequent voters. As we get up to super voters, all of the groups are kind of grouped together. There's an overall higher likelihood of saying they'll participate in state and local elections because they are super voters, but the priming experiment does not have much of an effect. When we look at whether or not you will vote in the 2024 general election, we see similar influence, right? Especially for infrequent voters, we see the threat primes here have a substantial effect on the importance of voting in the general election. But when we get up to super voters, again, there's not much effect when it comes to these experimental primes. Other measures in the survey were used to continue to test the role of threat. We had some explicit measures of threat. We asked respondents whether or not they agreed a second Trump presidency would destroy the country. And we also had some implicit measures of threat. Here we asked respondents to rate their feelings of Donald Trump on a scale of 0 to 100 without actually identifying Trump as a threat in the question, right? When we look at the results of these, we see a similar pattern as with the experiments, but the results are almost somewhat more pronounced. And so here, when looking at voting in the 2024 general election for the explicit Trump threat, those that believed a second Trump presidency would destroy the country, highlighted in red, were significantly more likely to say they were going to vote in the 2024 election across all of the propensity groups. And so even for super voters, this explicit threat of Trump makes a difference in understanding their likelihood of participating in the future. When looking at an implicit Trump threat here, just talking about rating Trump on a feeling thermometer, not necessarily saying Trump's a threat. Do you believe that he's going to destroy the country? There's no differences, no real big differences between those that rated Trump highly or warm or cold on the feeling thermometer across the group. So again, now we see, okay, we have experimental primes that seem to be making a difference. We have explicit questions that seem to be making a difference. But when we just talk about Trump himself, it's not as obvious. There's reason to believe that threat is what's doing it. It's not necessarily Trump. It's the threat of Trump actually destroying the country or making a difference in politics. So respondents presented with the question that contained a list of threats. for this last part of the survey, and we wanted to see if there were threats beyond Trump, threats beyond MAGA that could move people. In order to do so, we looked at each of a separate battery of threats and whether or not they would increase the probability of turnout amongst voter propensity groups. So this allowed for us to see whether or not there were some other areas of threat out there that might cause African Americans to move one way or another on their likelihood of participating, not just in the midterms, but looking forward. And so here we asked about the U.S. Supreme Court, about voter suppression, and about the COVID-19 pandemic. Specifically, we asked, does the Supreme Court pose no threat? Is it somewhat threatening, very threatening, or extremely threatening to the Black community? This part of the survey comes from questions as to, okay, what if Trump is not on the ballot in 2024? And what if GOP kind of moves beyond this Trump era, this Trump phase, and MAGA starts to fizzle out? Does this threat hypothesis, is this idea of threat even useful moving forward? Or is it going to be something else that we need to look towards, right? Are these ideas of threat going to still be powerful? And so we wanted to see if there were any other sort of longer institutional mechanisms here that were at play when it came to political threat. What we see is that perceptions of threat, even for these institutions that are sort of removed or devoid from the political parties and the political leadership themselves, still have a relationship with voter turnout. And this figure to the left, we can see as we move from the idea of vote suppression being not threatening at all to extremely threatening, all of the groups tick upwards, but especially infrequent voters, meaning that the effect or the likelihood that they say they will vote in 2024 increases as they believe or identify the issue of vote suppression as more threatening. And so here we see, even beyond Trump and the GOP, something such as voter suppression is threatening in a way to the Black community that it moves them. It makes them feel like they should participate. It makes them feel like they need to get out and do something. The Supreme Court, we see a similar trend, especially again here for the red line for infrequent voters. All of the groups seem to tick up a little bit, but for infrequent voters, we see that those that believe the Supreme Court is extremely threatening to the Black community are just as likely to say they're going to vote in 2024 as frequent voters and super voters. And so if there's a way to identify infrequent voters and convince them or message them or have them believe that some of these institutions, like the Supreme Court, are a threat if they fall out of Democrats' hands, or as they are now, if they are in Republicans' hands, the odds of them turning out and voting dramatically increases, right? We're looking at infrequent voters behaving far more like super voters or regular voters over time. Lastly, when it came to COVID-19, again, similar trend, a bit less pronounced, but here for non-voters and especially infrequent voters, as we move from not threatening to extremely threatening to the Black community for the COVID-19 pandemic, the likelihood that someone says they're going to vote in the 2024 general election shoots up. The last part of the presentation is going to talk about empowerment. Here, we looked at whether or not these ideas of political empowerment and racial efficacy worked in similar ways to threat when we don't necessarily have any clear Black leadership at the national level. Again, the Obama era is sort of a unique moment in American political history. We've moved on from that era. There's not a sort of beacon of hope that the Black community can look towards when it comes to national politics. And as the focus group suggested, even the sort of many lights of hope that might be out there across the country for people who are not actively in politics, who aren't consistently voting, they don't really know who these people are anyway. They have a hard time identifying them and thinking about them. So what does it mean to talk about empowerment? How does the idea of empowerment work for these people, for the Black community today? To test it, respondents were asked a series of 3 questions about racial efficacy to define an individual metric of either high empowerment or low empowerment. The idea of racial efficacy is investigating whether or not someone feels like they are being heard not just as an individual voter, but in this case, as a Black voter? Do you feel like you have representation that looks like you? Do you feel like the current representation listens to you and hears what you have to say as a member of the Black community? Specific ways to understand someone's ability to influence politics or their perception of how they can influence politics attached to their racial identity. This measure then was used to examine how moving from low to high levels of empowerment affects the probability of turning out among low and high propensity voters. And for example, right, here's the questions that were used to measure racial efficacy. How often would you say public officials work hard to help Black people? How often would you say Black people have a say in how government handles important issues? And finally, how often would you say Black people elected to office can make changes for the Black people in the community? When looking at racial efficacy, the results are pretty much the complete opposite of threat. We don't see much relationship at all between levels of racial efficacy and an individual's perception of turning out or their need to turn out. Here, we're looking at voting in the 2024 election as we compared those who had high empowerment to low empowerment across the racial propensity groups. The only group where we actually saw high empowerment related to more participation was among super voters. But again, even those with high empowerment are not very different from those with low empowerment. Other groups, we actually see an inverse relationship where those who are high empowered, those who feel like they have Black elected officials, they're not necessarily feeling like they need to get out and vote, though. They're not seeing voting in the 2024 election as an appropriate response to those Black elected officials. And in all likelihood, right, that's because if they have Black elected, if they're feeling efficacious based on their racial identity, it's most likely in local or state level politics. And so voting in 2024 is not going to be something as important to maintain that type of efficacy. So overall, empowerment is less effective in mobilizing turnout, according to the results of both the qualitative and quantitative research. If you recall, within the focus groups, when asked about empowerment, when asked about Black political leaders in the Democratic Party, there was cynicism and a lack of knowledge. So in both the qualitative and quantitative aspects, the results are far less straightforward than threat. Empowerment works for some groups, but the findings are not consistent and not as pronounced. Specifically here, looking at just the 2024 general election, increased measures of empowerment only increase the probability of voter turnout for super voters, a group that already has a high likelihood of turning out. And so it's not as useful in trying to bring new voters into the mix or trying to increase or close the gap, as I've mentioned before. And finally, a counterintuitive result and contrary to the hypothesis here is that empowerment has a negative effect on turnout among groups that are not super voters, with those scoring high in empowerment being less mobilized to turn out in the 2024 general election. And so, right, our results suggest that empowerment is not something that's going to be very useful right now to get African Americans to turn out at the national level. Few conclusions before I see if there's any questions from the group or the audience. Threat increases Black participation, especially among low propensity groups, across all three analytical models, the qualitative focus groups, the observational data, the measures that we discussed, and the experimental primes. Threat was consistently and significantly powerful when it came to predicting political participation. Trump and MAGA are the clearest threats and most top of the mind, reinforcing and centering sort of the threats they pose to African Americans is essential moving forward, even if Trump is not the GOP's nominee in 2024. The GOP threat is also effective in mobilizing the Black electorate in the absence of Trump on the 2024 ballot. And we saw this when looking especially at super voters. Right? Even with super voters, they understood sort of the nuances between a MAGA threat and a growing threat within the GOP itself. We also found that threat to the Black community from institutions and other groups also shows great potential to close the turnout gap. And so even if we are looking to move beyond Trump, to move beyond the MAGA movement in the next 5 to 10 years, there are still institutional threats out there that should be used and can be relied upon to continue to turn out Black voters. Broadening the source of threat beyond the political suggests the persistence of threat in everyday lives in the Black community. This is just something that the Democratic Party leadership is going to have to understand, that even without Trump, it's still more likely that the Black community is going to feel threatened than empowered. And as Stokely Carmichael said, right, Black empowerment is always reactive. There's always a threat to Black America coming from institutions of power that have been steeped in a history of white supremacy. And so moving towards a mode of empowerment is going to be very, very difficult without having another historic movement, a historic social movement like we did with President Obama. It's going to be very, very difficult to convince Black people and the Black community that their vote is going to change things in a positive way. Not as difficult to convince Black people that they need to vote to push back against threats coming at them, because every day there's a threat. Finally, cynicism tends to blunt the impact of political empowerment as a mobilizer of infrequent voters and others. This likely has more utility among those who vote frequently and have an established sense of their own political power. And so even when political empowerment is working and is useful, it's most useful for those who are already positively active and for those who are already participating all the time. And so if we're really looking to close the turnout gap in the near future, political empowerment is going to be a really tough sell. Because even if we get a historical moment or a historical candidate that creates a sense of racial efficacy amongst much of the Black community, it's mostly going to be affected or felt or understood by those who are already politically engaged and politically knowledgeable, right? And there's continued cynicism and a whole lot of cynicism you're going to have to get through in order for empowerment to and efficacy to affect those at the lower ends of the propensity spectrum. All right, so to sum up, we hope that this project continues. We're trying to continue to work with partners and funders here to get this research to get this research enduring through the 2024 election. We're hoping that the upcoming elections in 2023, the primary elections, often opportunities to conduct sort of randomized controlled experiments and field tests to understand in real time whether threat and empowerment message frames can work, right? And so we're looking at places like Virginia and smaller geographic areas, smaller elections, possibly not competitive elections, to start throwing these strategies out there and see what hits, right? The research suggests that threat is going to be the most likely one to hit. We also want to replicate this research on a state level. Much of what I presented was national data collected as a representative sample of the country. That's going to change when you start looking specifically at states like Georgia, states like Texas, states like North Carolina, that have their own unique attributes to them, their own political contexts, and their own unique Black populations as well. And so moving this research from a national level to a state level is going to be extremely important in understanding how these dynamics of threat and empowerment play out across the country and in different elections where Black folk have even more of an opportunity to make a difference, right? We've seen Black folk in Georgia turn the tide there in the last couple of elections. And lastly, we are aiming to collect another wave of survey data, and not just another cross-sectional wave, but an actual panel wave where we go back in the field and talk to the same people that we talked to in 2022 following the midterms. And so we hope that by looking at this panel back design with recontext, we'll be able to assess the dynamics of threat and empowerment after the midterms and looking at whether those dynamics change moving into 2024. And if there's something that's enduring between threat and empowerment, something that is either contextualized to the election or that exists over time in between elections and maybe leading up to elections that can be used or can be seen as more powerful moving forward. That's the end. I got through that pretty quick. I appreciate everyone for showing up. I don't know if there's any questions in the room or online, I'm happy to take them. There's also like 40 cookies over there, so everyone could take like 5 and some coffee. So thank you. Yes.
Hi, my name is Dr. Nkirika Catherine Ohebu. I just want to hear your thoughts now that with the recent charges against Trump, if you think that will have any impact on the upcoming election next year, and on how that might impact your the data that you've collected, and when you move it to the state level also.
Yeah, thank you. Great question. We anticipated Trump being sort of a fair weather fan here as far as a source of threat. It seems like the GOP is trying to find ways to move on from Trump, but his religious following makes that difficult. I think the way that the charges affect the upcoming election cycle is if he gets charged with anything that makes it so that it's illegal for him to run. Right? If he is actually charged with a felony and convicted of anything that removes him from presidential politics, of course that's going to affect things. If he's not, and he just has pending charges, or he's not indicted of anything, that might actually invigorate his followers even more. And we've seen this before. He's definitely been one to rise paranoia and conspiracy, especially amongst the MAGA group. And if he's able to do that and commandeer the Republican Party as he did in 2016, it might be a tough road, right? And in that case, it's very obvious where the threat needs to be identified, right? There needs to be a spotlight on Trump and the threat that he poses to the Black community if there's, any chance of continuing to close the turnout gap and get Black people to the polls at rates higher than the past couple cycles. It'll be obvious to Democratic voters, right? I think Republican voters at this point, basically since 2008 and 2012, if we're really talking about Obama's terms, America's been polarized. Democrats and Republicans have moved so far apart on so many issues, on things like healthcare, on things like immigration, on things like gun control, on things like abortion, that it's very hard to get Democrats and Republicans to cross the aisle, where it's going to probably be generations before we get to another stage in American politics where more people are moving towards the center than moving apart, right? And we've been moving apart pretty much since Obama's term, and we're continuing to do so. And so it's going to be very difficult, even if Trump's the candidate, to get a lot of Republicans to peel off due to charges against him, especially if he's continuing to push and media outlets are continuing to push rhetoric around him being innocent and being sort of a martyr for the masses. So I don't necessarily think that that's the case. I remember back in, it was 2016, I was going to give a talk at a small school in Nebraska. And this school was actually in one of the counties that was the second reddest county that went for Trump in 2016. The county of Wyoming was the reddest. And I was on this small plane with a bunch of people from the local town, and they were asking me, because I kind of stood out, like, what the hell are you doing going to Nebraska? And they said, I told them, and they're like, oh, so what do you think of Trump? And I'm like, I was trying to play it cool. I was in this little space. He's okay. He has a lot of controversial politics. And pretty much every single person on this plane says, we hate Trump. This is 2016. We don't like Trump. He's an idiot. But we're probably going to vote for him. And that was the sentiment, right? Because he was the Republican candidate, or the likely Republican candidate at the time. And if anything, since 2016, it's almost become more polarized, and people have stuck to their corners even more so since then. And so even with charges, I don't think it's going to derail him if he were to get the nomination, unless it were charges in a way, like I said, that legally forbid him from running for office.
You mentioned that the Democrats have a group of people that don't really vote, but they only come out based on fear. Is there any way to educate those people so that they're more highly motivated toward voting going forward? Not to separate them, but you understand what I'm saying.
Yeah, this is where this work gets really tricky, because we're basically saying through this research the most effective way to get Black people out to vote is to tell them how crappy the country is and how dangerous politics is if they don't speak their voice. The Democratic Party does not like that. Typically, Democrats are this beacon of hope. this party of inspiration, especially for Black folk and underrepresented groups. And so it's a tough sell, right? But I think in the short term, you have to understand that building these ideas of empowerment, building this sense of internal efficacy does not happen overnight. These are political attitudes that are enduring, that come from years and years of socialization in American society and political systems. And it's going to take generations, decades, lifetimes to potentially change, especially communities as disadvantaged as the Black community, to change how the Black community looks at American politics and American leadership and political systems. We're arguing if you want that to ever happen, you have to continue to win elections now. And right now, the best way to do that is to emphasize the threat. Once you emphasize the threat, if you get Black people voting at the same historic rates they voted in 2008 and in 2012, where you had 96% plus of registered Blacks voting, right? You had historic registration rates during those years. If you can get people to vote consistently at or close to those numbers, then you'll actually see more Black representation. You'll see more Black politicians winning office. You'll see more Black presidents, more Black Supreme Court justices being appointed, because Black voters will have that voice, right? That historic voice that changed elections in 2018 and 2012. You got to get there, though, right? And so it's kind of taking a short-term strategy to look towards a long-term goal, where if you continue to try and push this story of empowerment, of hope and change, and everything's great and the Democrats are going to save you, knowing that it's very unlikely that things are going to change much in the short term, this is where the Black community is very cynical. And it came out in this research alone, but there's decades and decades of anecdotes here where the Black community just does not think either party is really for them, right? And so if you want to move towards the sort of positive narrative where you're actually changing how Black people feel about politics and politicians in the political system, you have to find a way to get them out and voting as much as possible, as long as possible.
So Stacey Abrams, out of Georgia, they're doing some ground movement. What are they doing?
So Stacey Abrams has pretty much since 2014 or 2016 has had one of the largest mobilization efforts in the country in the state of Georgia. And so she's created a campaign called Black Voters Matter, where she's actually had small voter mobilization campaigns go around the state and register Black people across the state of Georgia to vote. And then they continue to go around the state and turn them out, make sure they go to the polls and vote if they're registered. She has buses on the ground doing this. And this is the type of campaign you're going to need if you're going to get Black people to vote without having some sort of psychological push to get them there. You have to go to their door with people that they trust, right? Stacey Abrams has had a long political career in Georgia. As the face of the movement, Black Georgians trust her now, right? It can't just be some random person. You have to have a trusted community partner, go to their door, tell them it's important you register, you got to get out to vote, right? It's going to make a change here in the state of Georgia. It's taken her 10 years to do that, and she's still lost governor twice. So to try and figure that out on a national scale or a multi-statewide scale is really, really difficult, right? It's not easy because there's so much cynicism, there's so many barriers, and as I briefly mentioned, right, we've barely talked about the role that voter suppression actually plays in making it difficult for people to register to vote and get to the polls as well. And so there are actually real political barriers, especially in states like Georgia and Florida and Texas, right, that make it difficult to register, make it difficult to get to the polls. The polls are not open all the time now. You can't just drop your ballot off in a box. So, great questions. Thank you.
There's a question online from the online audience. Some studies show that unlike Black voters, Latino and AAPI voters are demotivated to vote by primes pointing out their group's underrepresentation. Do you think that these threat results would be similar for other groups, or is there something unique about Black voters?
So there is some research that actually suggests that threat does work for other groups as well, specifically for Latinx populations. Here, my understanding is that it comes down to political psychology. And in order to get someone to get out and take action, you have to get them angry. If you make someone scared or sad, they're going to become apathetic and start to withdraw. And so that's where, in some of the literature, where primes actually point out deficits and disadvantages and discrepancies in resources or in turnout, those are going to make people feel sad. They're going to make people feel like they don't have a chance, right? But if you prime specifically about threat and an understanding of threat that doesn't necessarily make people feel sad or scared, but makes them angry, it's far more likely to get them out and take action, right? And it's a psychological mechanism. And we've seen this not only within community of colors, but this is how the far right has been working since the 1960s, right? Pretty much since the Goldwater era, primes of fear, tactics of threat have been used to make different populations so angry that they'll do anything to make sure that things go their way, right? And then you start to get down these roads of paranoia and conspiracy, because if you're so angry that you can't believe the world is going in a certain way, you're going to justify how you think it should be no matter what, right? And that doesn't come from fear or sadness. That comes from anger, this sort of gut reaction, this gut need to take action. And so that's where we believe these ideas of threat are still useful. And again, research has shown that they are useful for other groups as well. Another great question.
Thank you so much. Thank you
Again, for those here, please take as much as you can.